You're watching Press TV. Time now for the news review program. Hungary is urging the EU to change its strategies on Ukraine. It's saying that Western sanctions on Moscow have failed.
West's strategy on Ukraine has failed as governments in Europe are collapsing like dominoes. Energy prices have surged. A new strategy is needed, which should focus on peace talks and drafting a good peace proposal instead of winning the war.
The Hungarian Prime Minister says that the sanctions were aimed at destabilizing Russia's leadership in the war. But he says that Ukraine will never win the war this way, as the Russian army has asymmetrical dominance. Viktor Orban says the war can come to an end only by peace talks between Russia and the U.S. He stressed that Hungary is not willing to support the EU's limitations on Russian gas imports. Orban warned that this would undermine the European economy. The bloc has imposed a wave of sanctions on Russia, targeting key sectors. Let me now invite a couple of guests to get some more insight on this and update ourselves. So a couple of guests joining me. Jerome Hughes, our correspondent in Brussels. Also Greg Simons, he's an author and researcher in Uppsala, Sweden. Great to have you with us, gentlemen. Now let's go to Jerome. Tell us what the EU's measures have been like, the anti-Moscow measures over Ukraine, and what they are up to, and if they've been effective or actually backfired.
Well, the thing about it is, I think there is no doubt. I mean, Viktor Orban himself, he certainly he has his critics. I mean, he's a very xenophobic person, to say the least. That's putting it gently. But actually, I think there's a growing sentiment in the EU that on this particular point, he's really hitting the nail on the head. And there's a growing feeling amongst citizens that we're going down the wrong direction. Because let's face it, inflation is out of control due to energy, mainly due to energy prices. And also we have a massive influx of refugees coming from Ukraine. So EU nations are dealing with that. And yet at the same time, there's constant flow of weapons to Ukraine as well, which is costing a fortune. And all the while, these sanctions against Russia are really hurting the EU, it seems, more than they are Russia. So people are saying, yes, you could target Russia if you want, in terms of, you know, more sanctions on Russia, individuals or the banking systems or so on, but don't target energy. I mean, the EU stopped gas, has banned oil and coal coming from Russia into the EU, but it wants Russia to actually increase the volumes of gas. So, you know, there's a lot of hypocrisy going on here, and there's a lot of unhappiness as well in relation to the European Commission. It has been said to me by many, including senior officials inside the European Commission, I have to say, that basically there's a feeling Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the Commission, and Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, are reaching way beyond their mandate. Normally, when the Commission delivers a proposal, for example, this 15% reduction in gas, normally all of the individual member states are contacted beforehand, and there's a consensus before the Commission comes out and proposes it. They call it a proposal because more often than not, mostly with measures, unless they're emergency measures, they have to be agreed by the European Parliament. But normally the countries, individual countries, are on board. But for example, Spain is saying they didn't know anything about this 15%. The way that works is they want 15% reduced from the start of next month, August, to the end of March, and it's averaged out. So whatever the individual countries used during that period over the past 5 years, it's averaged out, and you reduce by 15%. But if you look at France, it gets almost 70% of its energy from nuclear. There are a few problems with the nuclear supply at the moment, but Germany was getting 40% of its gas from Russia. So, you know, obviously when you reduce 15% from France, it's going to have a much less impact on France than it would, say, on Germany. So actually it seems like a very sort of a measure that's just been put down on the ground without consultation of member states. And just finally on this one, Behruz, that's the energy ministers are going to meet here in Brussels on Tuesday, and I think that's going to be quite an explosive meeting, because they're meeting to decide on this 15%, and I think there's going to be a lot of opposition to it.
Okay, we'll be looking forward to see what's going to happen there. Greg, the Hungarian official is saying that, Mr. Orban is saying that Western sanctions against Moscow have failed. Do you agree with them, or do you believe that they are on the right track and they should keep placing sanctions on top of sanctions against the Kremlin?
We have a couple of problems here. I mean, Orban is absolutely right. He's a realist, and he's spoken what are actually facts. But the problem with the EU and so-called liberal democracies in general, they've become quite messianic, and they've become quite zealous. This, on the one hand, so they hide behind these different filter bubbles and echo chambers. But secondly, the EU never diverges from strategic imperatives of the United States. So even if they do know that it's senseless in terms of achieving what they say it will achieve, that is to pressure Russia, but instead it has negative impacts on the EU countries, they will continue to do it anyway. So it's highly problematic. But as I say, I mean, Orban is absolutely correct in what he says.
Mm-hmm. And Greg, Orban also believes that the solution to this Ukraine issue and the war is actually talks to be held between the U.S. and Russia, not others. Do you share the same viewpoint?
Well, absolutely, because if you look, every time Ukraine has, or Zelensky has made noises about creating some kind of peace deal, that they had either the British Prime Minister, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or some US official visit them, and then all of a sudden the talks are off, and Ukraine goes back onto its original policy, which is dictated from Washington. It's not dictated from Kiev, and this is clear from a number of high-ranking US officials, such as the Secretary of Defense. He stated that, well, not alone, that they wanted to create a long war in order to inflict a geopolitical defeat on Russia in Ukraine and to contain Russia. This is not only about Ukraine. Ukraine is the mechanism.
All right. Jerome, we have 1 minute or so. If you could tell us how do people on the streets feel about this? I mean, there certainly should be more pressing issues in the EU than, arming Ukraine with weaponry.
I think there's a great deal of sympathy for ordinary Ukrainian citizens here in the European Union, and at the start there was everyone was waving Ukrainian flags and putting them on the front of their houses and marching through the streets, and everything was about Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. But I actually think now people are becoming more educated. Perhaps they see that the situation is more nuanced, that there's a growing sort of acceptance that perhaps Russia was provoked or has been provoked, not to justify in any way war, because nobody wants war, but in the case that it could have been prevented, this situation. And so actually there is a certain amount of fatigue setting in because of this endless amount of money that is being sent to Ukraine, not only to keep the government going there, but let's face it, we saw Zelensky sacking senior officials recently, so there's widespread corruption at the highest levels, which continues, and 17 billion was sent before February, by the way, over the past few years, 17 billion from the EU. That's nothing to do with what came from the United States, and now more for weapons. And people really here in the EU are struggling to survive with the cost of living crisis. So I think people are becoming more educated, and as I say, there is the sympathy is lessening somewhat.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this episode. Thank you, my guests, Jerome Hughes in Brussels and Greg Simons in Uppsala.